Welcome to Computer Says Maybe. I'm your host, Alix Dunn. I'm really excited to be doing this for a first time with Janet Haven and Charlton McIlwain. Correct?
Perfect.
Great. The board chair and executive director of an organization I've admired for a really long time, who's been doing challenging work to help apply academic inquiry and grounded research and understanding how technology is affecting society. And we're going to have kind of a wide-ranging conversation about how the organization has evolved, the implications given the current kind of collapse of funding in academic spaces at the same time that technology is sort of ravaging our world in all kinds of different ways. And it feels a bit like we're flying blind. So getting a sense of how the Institute is thinking about that situation. And then we'll kind of, have a free-ranging conversation about the role of research right now in society. So starting with you guys, I feel like starting with just like where data in society came from as a project. It's been 10 years.
11.
I'm so sorry.
11 years. We celebrated our 10th anniversary last year. Exactly a year ago, in fact.
Yeah, okay.
That's right.
A lot has changed in 11 years. But Janet, do you want to talk a little bit about how it came about as an organization so we can get into how it's changed?
Yeah, absolutely. So Data in Society was founded by Dana Boyd. Dana is still an advisor to the organization. She is truly a visionary. And what she saw 12 or 13 years ago when she was working at Microsoft Research in the social media collective there was the idea that the study of the societal impacts of data-centric technologies, of automated technologies, was just not happening and in any scale, at any organized way. And her insight was, this is going to really matter. We really need to understand this to be able to integrate these technologies into our world. We really need to be able to understand it, to govern these technologies in smart ways. And so she started Data in Society primarily in the early days, and Charlton was there in the very early days, primarily as a space for researchers who were, a disparate crowd of researchers in those very early days, who just a few people who were starting to ask these kinds of questions and to ask them through the lens of not just sort of the hype and, fear cycles that tech companies were putting out, but through the lens of power, through the lens of inequality, and in a way that really started with people and their experiences with these technologies. So you were there. Tell us about it.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds pretty much right. And for me, I remember precisely that kind of entry point. Like for me, number one, I had not come from a long history and background of studying technology. I had studied electoral politics and then sort of migrated towards questions around technology that were interesting to me. And so Data in Society and meeting Dana was one of those moments of, oh, you're thinking about this in the way that I am, and I would have thought other people would, but come to find out that was not the sort of the lens. And so people were coming with the heavy, let's talk about the technology, let's talk about the material artifacts, and a lot less about the people. My concern before all of this was about people in sort of situations of power, access, politics. And so blending those was important for me, and Data in Society was a place I started to see that work happening.
So it started out as kind of a gathering place for researchers that were asking the kinds of questions that were probably critically important, but maybe a little bit early in the field of people sort of thinking about the social and political implications. And then it became like a research institute.
It was very, very prescient. So I joined the organization about a year and a half after it was founded, and I had known Dana for years. I came from the Open Society Foundations, which is a philanthropic organization, and I had been there for almost a decade and a half and had worked, broadly across issues of technology, human rights, accountability, and governance. So I really had felt that lack of an evidence base and a lack of attention to how these technologies that when I was at the Open Society Foundations, we were sort of funding or trying to figure out, how to incorporate into a whole, set of issues around the world, how they actually were impacting people on the ground. And so I had actually come to Dana when I was still at the Open Society Foundations because we were grappling with this question, which now seems very quaint, of the idea of we called it algorithmic manipulation of the public sphere. And Dana had just started Data and Society. And so I went to her and said, what do you think about this? Can you tell us about this? And that actually was one of the questions that started Data and Society's sort of long engagement with algorithmic accountability, with the study of mis and disinformation, and other things. I mean, that was work they were already doing. And so I was, it was a really, really interesting conversation that came about. But when I came into the organization, I am not a trained researcher. I am an admirer and, embracer of research. And I see the need of it so much. And particularly from my previous work, the need for research to inform governance. That was a huge gap that we had. And so as I came into the organization, what I was really interested in was how do we continue to foster this environment that has produced such interesting research and such a powerful and new research network. But then how do we also make sure the research that's coming out of that is being used in spaces where we can see its real impact and its real change that it brings about. And so over the years, we built up a communications team that has done a lot of work around, counter narrative and, challenging some of the hype coming out of the tech industry around technologies. We've built up a policy team that was very involved particularly during the Biden administration, where there was a lot of interest and a lot of attention to how we govern AI at that moment. And we have built up an approach to sort of fostering and hopefully even continuing now to grow out our network, because we've had a lot of people pass through and be involved with Data and Society over the years, which has been really a very, very important part of the organization's history.
Yeah. So Charlton, you became board chair when?
That's a great question. I should know. I think about 3 years ago now.
Okay.
Yeah.
And do you want to say a little bit about, because you mentioned electoral politics and research in that area, do you want to say a little bit more about your center and kind of the work you do and maybe where the organization was when you joined?
Yeah, that's an interesting story and evolution. So as I said, my research for 10 years was interested in race and electoral politics, and particularly the ways that political candidates mobilized race to negatively affect the electoral chances of Black and other marginalized candidates. And so that was the persistent question for me. And, mid 2000s, late 2000s, I started to find that people that were interested in that work were doing that work online. And so that's what got me sort of in the technological spaces that folks were on at the time. And then soon my interests and questions that were driving me were about those technologies. Right. And so I remember early on engaging with some of my colleagues. I'm an academic. I was in a traditional research academic department at NYU. And I remember going to a colleague of mine named Helen Nissenbaum, and I said, Helen, I found your article from 1996 called Bias in Computer Systems. Mm-hmm. And I said, that was the most illuminating article to me. And I said, what happened to those questions from 1996 to the present? This was probably 2009, 2010. And she said, I don't know. But it certainly was not part of the literature that I saw that had very specific questions around what does bias really mean? What does it mean to think about people and how they are approaching and engaging with technologies in ways that either create some sense of advantage or disadvantage. So those were kind of novel questions. I didn't see those questions being asked. I didn't see other people asking those same questions. And then really it was a chance meeting and introduction with Safia Noble. And we both sort of had that moment of sitting down. She was at a conference at NYU around security and talking about facial recognition technology. And she was like, this stuff is going to be really, really, really bad. And I said, I think I know, but I don't really know anything about it. And then I was talking about bias and saying, where are the folks that are talking about these things? And she said, I don't know. And so we sort of decided there, we should probably find our people in some way. And when I say our people, both people who were talking about that human side of technology, but also who were really centering issues around race and marginality, questions of power and access. So finding those people who were talking both about that in the context of technology. And what eventually came out of that was we started to slowly find those people. We decided to start an organization that was called the Center for Critical Race and Digital Studies. And it has both then and over the years really just been a hub network for people that do just that. Think about technology deeply in terms of its social, political, human implications, but really centering questions around race, ethnicity, marginalization in that. The last thing I will say, and this is the data and society connection, was early on in our founding of that organization, I like to say we were sort of in the shadow of data and society, meaning many of the folks that we had started to gather started to then be part of, they were fellows at DNS, they were showing up at data and society meetings, they were giving talks, all these kinds of things. And so in a lot of ways, the folks that I were around and the network around data and society were very close, even from those early days.
Super interesting. I feel like it's also interesting to think about you coming from academia and academic inquiry, and you coming from philanthropy that has sort of an opinion potentially about the world that it wants to see. That obviously sort of comes together in data and society as a strategy of thinking about research that serves some purpose beyond just let's ask interesting questions as academics and write papers and talk to each other about them. Do you all want to I would love to hear a little bit about how you think about the mix of opinions about the world or sort of thoughts about how the world should be, combining with trying to, use scientific methods and inquiry and really sort of find evidence and understand evidence about what's happening in the world. How do those two things kind of come together for the organization?
I'll start again with a story because it really has shaped my perspective on this from a long time ago to this point. I wrote a book called Race Appeal back in around 2009 or so, 2009, 2010. And I remember when it was written, it won a couple of awards, and I remember a sort of legendary figure in the field of political science saying, this is a great book, but it had no soul.
Burn. Oh my God.
Oh my God. Can you imagine
Wow.
the sinking feeling to read those words, especially with the upside of this was a great and powerful book. And then the drop.
The ultimate nag. God.
It's like, whew.
Yeah.
But almost immediately I knew what she meant by that. And it was that it was a book that was heavy on numbers and a particular kind of data, but was not foregrounding the kind of why. Like, why does it matter that this is a group of people that I'm concerned about, focused on, and that makes a difference in some way? And there was a lack of that kind of connection with the people and not just the problem, right? And so that was a point at which I sort of consciously decided that I was going to do my scholarship in a very different way. That is, I wasn't going to be overly concerned by folks who said you had to have some sense of objectivity, or you couldn't have an opinion that was sort of guiding your research questions, or certainly not your outcomes. but to think of myself as being able to walk and chew gum at the same time. Like, I can still maintain my commitment to rigorous methodology, to the evidence speaking for itself and being able to place it in its right context, and not be lying that if it might be inconsistent with my political opinions or normative beliefs about certain outcomes or ways that I want to see the world. But what I did find was, if I was able to shift that, I did much better research, because what I really understood was that texture about, is there more to just winning and losing an election that is important here? Is there something more than just saying, do I have access to a technology or not? What is the deeper set of concern? What is that sort of thing that gets me closer to people and really understanding that dimension? And that's what I think that sort of reshuffling of those two things did for me in my work.
I love that frame of connecting with the people, not just the problem, because I feel like that's such a good encapsulation of what happens when when people try and sort of flatten the process and make it feel science-y. They actually remove the most essential part of the equation, which is people.
Absolutely.
And I feel like that's just a really powerful way of framing that. Janet, what do you think? I mean, you've had to when building out like a policy team, for example, obviously you have a team of researchers who have, they're trained researchers. They use rigorous methodologies to uncover evidence about the world around them. But obviously with a policy team, you want to participate in that conversation in a particular way. So do you want to talk a little bit about sort of how the organization has managed that?
From research to policy?
Yeah.
So I think starting from the policy end, we want to go into the policy debates around governing technology with an evidence base. But an evidence base can mean a lot of different things, right? Like how we get to evidence is is a methodological question, but it's also a question of where you even start your research. And, I would say one of our big commitments at Data and Society is that we start our research not from the stories that are coming out of the tech industry or our sort of, assumptions about what technology does in the world or what it can do or its benefits, but from the lived experience, and particularly the lived experience of people who are on the margins, who generally do not get listened to, who don't have a say in the technology that they're using, and don't get asked like what their experience is. And so that really shapes the kinds of outcomes we can get to, because it tells us a completely different story. And so in some ways, I think our commitments and our values in terms of, how we align that with rigorous research and rigorous methodologies, it comes from how we form our questions and who are the groups that we're asking those questions of or we're working with in participatory ways to build an evidence base. Just to give an example of that, which is, I think it's an early example from Data and Society, but it is still a great one, is the work of Alex Rosenblatt, who wrote a book called Uberland, which was about how Uber is redefining the rules of work. And her starting point was that she started doing this research in 2014. Her starting point was Uber's claim that their drivers were happy entrepreneurs. And Alex asked, do Uber drivers think they're entrepreneurs? Like, are they happy being entrepreneurs? Like, what does that mean if you're an Uber driver? Because you're sort of like still, being kind of bossed around by your phone and like the Uber app. And so like, how does that work? And so to answer that question, she did not go to Uber and ask them, what does it mean for these people to be entrepreneurs? Tell me about your marketing materials. She went and rode around with Uber drivers for several years and asked them what their experience was. And she wrote this book based on what she learned, which was, a very broad and very interesting evidence base, but that really landed on this idea that Uber drivers aren't really entrepreneurs. They're being algorithmically managed by the technology that Uber has built and deployed as a way to control a whole set of Uber drivers around the country, around the world. So then the question of how does that become, how do we take that kind of research, which is grounded, it's about people who don't usually have a voice, and how do we move that into a policy space? We decided to build a policy team within Data and Society because what we saw happening was this sort of, hope in many places where people are doing academic research and wanted to have impact, that they would put it out and it would get picked up and become part of the policy conversation. And that sometimes happens, but usually you need to have some kind of translational function that is packaging that research in a way that policymakers can grasp, that probably has a lot less nuance than the original research that is done, that is communicated in, to some extent, a policy ready way. Like, what do you take away from it to actually apply to a regulatory environment or to legislation or something like that. And so what we decided was that we really needed to have that in-house function really close to the researchers so that we didn't lose as much in translation, that we were able to really carry the power of that evidence, of those voices that came through in our research all the way through into policy spaces. And so that in many ways was the goal of starting our policy team inside the organization, rather than, pursuing maybe a more traditional route, which would be like partnering with an extra think tank or policy organization. We've experimented in a lot of ways. And I would say that, in terms of researchers moving into policy spaces, I think there is a lot of opportunity for researchers to do that. And many of our researchers have written policy briefs, have been part of the political and policy process. It's been sort of a two-way street between our research team and our policy team to really learn how to translate, academic work into policy language that can be understood. And I think the best work that we've done in the policy space is where we have these really tight collaborations between our policy team and our expert researchers.
Mm.
How does it work, though? Because I feel like in the process of asking a research question, producing, let's say, a paper, understanding an answer to a question, the gap between that and then having policy prescription, so saying, like, this is what we think should happen, like, how does that actually happen?
We're doing sort of empirical grounded research. So one of the outcomes that we had to accept is that not all of that is going to generate policy prescriptions.
Sure, yeah.
And that's okay. Like, some of it has, it all has value, but it may have value in different ways, right? Like, a policy outcome is only one way that research can be impactful in the world. It can also be impactful in the world in shaping academic fields and shaping new kinds of inquiry. It can be impactful in the world in telling stories and narratives. It can be impactful in, bringing people to the table who were not previously given space, that essentially new communities are recognized as, sort of legitimate voices in a public debate. So there's a lot of ways. Policy is not the only way. I think that there are a bunch of factors, right? So one is that it's never one piece of research.
Yeah, sure. Okay.
It's never a one-to-one translation. It is, every good piece of policy work that we've ever put out is standing on the shoulders of citational giants, right? And that's a big part of our policy work, is that we have a deep citational practice. So that's one important thing, is that, research is additive, it's cumulative to get to policy recommendations. I think it's also opportunistic. Sometimes you just put out, you just kind of land at the right moment where you have a piece of research coming out that happens to be just like meeting the moment. For instance, right now, one of our teams is doing research on mental health and chatbots. And that has turned into a huge issue in, in policy circles, right? How do we protect people who are both leaning on chatbots for mental health support and may also being harmed through their health by chatbots? How do we build protections?
Statewide bans right now coming out. Was it Illinois? That
Yes.
basically said, no,
bans
you
on
legally can't actually offer a chatbot for the purpose of therapy.
So that's about apps that claim to be therapists.
Yeah.
But many more people are just
using general purpose,
general purpose LLMs.
But this is an attempt at defining a policy that supports
correct.
conditions within which a model's not being used in ways that you would.
Exactly. Yeah. So our team that's working on that just put out not a policy brief, but an op-ed today that was published about essentially what their research is saying about this moment and the kinds of guardrails that need to be built around these technologies. Given what they're seeing in terms of how people are using these tools to foster better mental health.
That's a really good example because I can immediately imagine once you build evidence around where it's causing harm, in what conditions it's causing harm, I can very easily imagine that translating into more prescriptive assertions that X is not appropriate or potentially considering policy related to Y. So I feel like that's
it gives you a chance to say, like, here's what we're seeing. It may not be the do this right now, but it's informative. It can be informative of, a direction in governance or a particular set of protections that maybe hadn't been considered.
So it's basically a function of relevance. Like if your research question is good enough and you're producing research that is topical and timely enough to be of the moment where policymakers are thinking about the issue, then it's basically like, here's research that's going to inform policy because you're looking for that piece of information like right now.
Yeah. Sometimes it works that way, but there's lots of good research that's done that it's relevant 3 years later.
Relevant deeply, but policymakers don't care. I imagine.
Exactly. But I think also a lot of times there's not that, Janet mentioned the translational work. And I think that's the piece that's missing. Translation requires people who translate. And sometimes that is missing, particularly when we think about this mix of the academic world and policy world or civil society. And I think it's one of those things that also makes data and society a very unique place because you don't have typically in academia that sort of feedback, number one, that feedback loop. So academics talking to policymakers in ways that shape both ends of that spectrum in terms of the questions that get asked, but also the particular applications of them or prescriptions that might follow. So there's often not that opportunity. Also, I think there's a lot of great research that happens in the context of academic institutions and traditional research contexts that doesn't get utilized or find a home in terms of policy, et cetera, because there just simply isn't a ready translator there to be able to say, there's something in here that is important. Let me connect that with people over here who are thinking about, this outcome or that one. And I think, sort of getting back to another sort of story about what was unique about data and society was this sort of excitement and the ability to have those two pieces in the same place, a much tighter feedback loop. And I think the ability then to move more quickly, right? To, most of the academics that I talk to, whether they're in technology fields or otherwise, often say the reason that they do what they do is to try to make a difference in the world in some meaningful way. Academia doesn't really lend itself to that all the times in terms of the structures, the incentives, et cetera, that are driving what's important for an academic researcher or tenure track faculty member or what have you. So to have a kind of separate space that makes that possible, I think is what makes a lot of traditional academic researchers excited about a place like Data and Society, and also gives fuel to their work in thinking that what they research, what they come up with, the knowledge they produce can really have an impact in some real way.
It's interesting. Because I feel like one thing I think a lot about is the asymmetry of resources between the people causing the problems and the people researching the problems they're creating.
For sure.
And I think about that. There's that pie chart in a paper that Abeba put together a couple of years ago, showing the proportion within academic conferences about machine learning and computer science, the proportion of them coming from academia versus industry, and how much that's changed. Yeah. And basically it's flipped. So it's gone from like 25% industry, 75% civil society or academia, to now 25% civil society and academia, 75% industry. So essentially academia is now in some ways not necessarily co-opted, but it's a piece of infrastructure for industry in some ways because they have the money and the resources. So then you've got these little institutions like Data and Society that's kind of trying to like keep up and be like, we need independent research and independent things being produced to like help us understand what's happening. How do you think about those resource asymmetries, especially when, you know, all the funding cuts happening and kind of the overall environment? It feels like one of scarcity outside of industry and one of like opulence and control inside industry.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's a lot of asymmetry there. There is a lot of asymmetry there. And I want to say, I just want to say her name clearly, Abeba Birhan, who wrote that fantastic paper and who is a brilliant researcher into algorithmic accountability and algorithmic AI governance.
I think I mention her on basically every episode.
Yeah.
So I feel like at this point, I feel like I'm a stan. So carry on. Yeah.
I'm such a fan. I'm such a fan of hers that we can just talk about it, babe.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think for us, we have to think about how we, put our resources in the places that we think are going to have the most impact. And I would say, I think that's why, Data and Society is structured in a way so that we have all of these functions under one roof, because I think that's the way that we can have the greatest impact with research, so that we have, research foundations, we have, policy blueprints, we have this function of creating counter narratives, and then we have this network power angle. And essentially, like, trying to bring all of that under one roof is what I think creates more bang for the buck, that it gets us further than having a kind of disparate network. I am a believer in institutions. And so, I think one thing that, Dana did that was so brilliant, among the many brilliant things she did, was to start an organization, to plant the flag that this isn't just an idea or an academic field or a journal. It is an organization that deserves public support. And it's a set of ideas that deserve public support because it is work that's happening in the public interest. I've been in philanthropy, I've been on the nonprofit side. I mean, the sort of asymmetry of resources is a story as old as time.
Yeah.
That's not something we're going to solve. So we have to think about, how do we direct our energy and build our institutions in a way that they have the most power and the most impact.
I just feel like this case, and I agree it's a tale as old as time, but right now it feels so pronounced. Just like the casual tens of millions, tens of billions of dollars that these companies are throwing at things, they're like lighting money on fire, or lighting communities on fire by building all these things in their backyard. But it just feels like part of the story is that asymmetry more than maybe it is in other situations. And I'm wondering, are there like corollary fields that you all think about where research has been externalized in this way?
I do think it is a particular moment in time where, as a society, we are in the process of turning away from the public interest, that we're turning away from public institutions, from protecting public institutions, that we're turning away from the new, the creation of new public knowledge. And we are seeing, a corporatization of government. and that's happening, in a way that is absolutely driven by a tech oligarchy, but I think is being embraced by other parts of society, including parts of the government that, should have a duty of care for the public interest. And I think we are seeing a historic turning away from that.
Feels also like we're intentionally turning the light off in the room in this way, where it's like we don't want to know or something. Like it's like, let's just stop trying to know.
Ignorance.
How do you feel? I mean, I feel like you're more situated in academia, so maybe you're feeling the sting.
With the narrowing of where funding is coming from, and which so much of that spigot, if you will, being turned off, shut off, it narrows the range of the kinds of questions that you can ask or that people are empowered to ask. And I think that, coupled with this sort of corporatization, this sort of real moment to seize the moment for these giant companies to really dominate is part of that. I mean, part of the conversation that's happening right now is across all these academic institutions, who's filling in the gap, right? Who's filling in that money slot that was coming from NSF and NIH and people that were funding this work. And either it will be no one, which means that work does not happen anymore, or it means I have to go find who is funding it. And you're back right into the laps of the giant corporations. And typically that work is through a very specific lens of, I have a product, so I want to know something about the implications or impact or how will this be used? But it's really just about my product. I'm not really caring about a wider lens. And I think that's where we then really scrap all of this sense of that duty of care, that fidelity to the public interest. And we just, however asymmetrical it always is to think about public interest and corporate interest, at least there is something there to create a tension, but we're moving to a place where that tension won't even be there because of that, so much of that dominance. I was thinking back to an example from last 2 years, where I was working with a group of researchers and working with folks at NSF around this question of how do we better engage, involve people at the community level, and particularly people in underserved communities, around technology development, deployment, et cetera. And really at the point that was so optimistic of people asking questions about how do we really flip these scenarios in some way to get communities more buy-in, to enact processes that would help diminish the risk of harm when certain technologies are built and used in and around those communities. And all of that work, which was deeply institutional and systemic in terms of what research gets funded, what types of accountability for people doing research around technology in particular communities, all that is functionally disappeared at this point. The people who championed it and the questions and the ability, the funding, et cetera, to really pursue those. And, corporations have stepped in a bit with, hey, we're concerned about this, but I'm always deeply distrustful.
I think that's valid.
and I think, just to build on that, yes, everything Charlton said, I think there's also, there's a methodological foreclosure, which is that in this environment where I think the tech companies do wield a lot of, power in terms of the questions that get asked, they also wield a lot of power in terms of the methodologies that are used. And they both are going to be foregrounding, quant analytics, right? And sort of looking at the world through the lens of like, well, what do we know about, the impact of, Chat GPT in the world through the lens of the data that comes back from Chat GPT, which of course is like, the snake eating its tail, right? Like we're like in this like sort of logical loop of like, we only know what that enclosure of that platform tells us. So like, that's a really gigantic loss. Instead of looking to, grounded social science, grounded, ethnographies that really look at not only the primary impacts of these tools in terms of how people are using them, what it means in their lives, but the secondary and tertiary impacts on communities, on, the larger economy, and all of those questions. We really lose that. And I think that is incredibly dangerous when it is coupled with the challenges that we're seeing with our government right now, the loss of public data. And as our founder, Dana Boyd, would say, we start to lose, how do we know what we know? Like we lose that kind of public base of knowledge about the world around us in really dangerous ways.
I think it's also coupled at a time when journalism is collapsing, which is, I think, where you get some of the more, maybe not full ethnographies that are multi-year and longitudinal and like telling lots and lots of stories, but you still get stories.
Yeah.
And it feels like that's going away too. And it feels replaced by these very superficial sort of quantitative, quick hit, like this is what's happening coming from industry.
I feel like there has been a sort of generation of tech journalists that have, kind of come into play and sort of come on the public scene, particularly over the past 5 years, who are doing amazing work,
100%, yes.
and that are just, holding the line in ways that, I feel so grateful for. Karen Howe's book, The Empire of AI, is, the sort of most obvious case.
100 breaking stories in a single book.
Yeah. I mean, it is an amazing, amazing book that tells us so much, not just about the story of OpenAI, but just tells us so much about the political economy and, the social impacts of AI as it is, being sort of thrust upon the world right now.
Yeah.
And I think, Karen is sort of the maybe the best known journalist because of that book. But I think there are a lot of journalists that are doing great work. Kari Johnson at Cal Matters, Kashmir Hill at the New York Times. I feel like we're seeing a generation of great tech journalists that are pushing back on the hype and the narratives that come out of the tech companies. And I think that's just an incredible of incredible value, to sort of maintaining a real dialogue in the public sphere or in public spheres. And I see as a real companion to the kind of work that Data and Society does. I mean, it means we and, our peer organizations and peer researchers in academia are not, sort of the only game in town in terms of where to get really solid information and sense making about the world right now.
Well, I feel like, this kind of segues into a last question, thinking a little bit about, when you were describing the beginning of Data and Society, it was like a elite nerd club. And I feel like that has changed a lot in 10 years. And I feel like it's changing even more now in terms of what might be necessary to engage more and more people in these conversations. So I know you guys are running this New York Public Library series and are generally more interested in broader public engagement. So I'm curious what you all are working on in that space. But I think more broadly, like, what role do you think the public should play? How can the public participate more in this conversation outside of kind of the halls of the academy?
I will say, that one of the questions since I've been on the board and been board chair, much concern and really thought about who do we engage, right? And I think it's been this precise question. We do a great job and we are known for producing great, groundbreaking, grounded research in all the ways that Data and Society is known for. but where does it go, and is it reaching the people that we really see as being able to guide that broader mission around justice and equity? And there's only so much that we can do as the sort of the nerd club in producing.
With the utmost respect, I say that.
Of course.
Yeah.
But, frequently that has been the network, right? And we produce knowledge in part because we have other colleagues who are interested in that work, and it strengthens that network and the breadth in which that knowledge that gets produced gets out into the world. But I think the critical question that I have been interested in since I came to the board in particular, and have had such a positive engagement with researchers and everyone across the organization, is if we say what we really want to do is to shift power, who's in the best position to do that? Mm-hmm. Is it me in our ivory tower? Is it in a civic org in some way? Or is it the people themselves? And I think ultimately that's where we come down to the answer that at some point people matter, and people really have the agency to make change in ways that often we can't through policy or through the typical ways that we work. So then the question becomes, how is the work that we are producing engaging with and getting to that broader group of the public? And I think that is one of the things that I'm excited about, the New York Public Library series and other ways that we're thinking through how do we close this gap between our organization and the people that we really want it to serve.
I feel like part of that, it's getting the information. So this translation piece that we keep coming back to, I think it is getting information in the hands of the public, but it also feels like there's a missing feedback loop, or missing blood-brain barrier between the public and the people that are doing this work. So, I know you've been thinking about what it might look like to not just inform the public or include them in our thinking about who key audiences are, but actually try and help a public process everything that's happening and shape even what questions we're asking.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah, I think I have been thinking about that a lot. I feel like, and I will say I really credit another board member of Data and Society, Michelle Miller, for sort of giving me this language of sense making. Having worked in this field for 25 years, that there's an unusual moment right now where there is so much desire across the general public to understand, to make sense of what people are seeing with the conversation around AI at the conversation, but also just AI arriving in their lives and, upending their kids' education and sort of coming into their workplaces, and suddenly they're required to do, 30% of their work on AI. What does that mean? Or they see the United States government taking, gigantic stakes in chip companies. Why is that?
Yeah.
We see articles in the New York Times that say maybe AI is sentient. What?
Yeah.
What does that mean? And AI is going to both, cause mass unemployment, but also bring about mass prosperity. How do we reconcile these stories?
It's an environmental disaster, and it's also going to fix all of our problems with climate. Yeah.
And then, our kids are, writing their, high school essays in blue books again because they are not allowed to use computers because ChatGPT, it's a real moment of, I would say, on the ground mass experience of a kind of thing that is kind of unusual. And so when the New York Public Library came to us and said, hey, would you guys like to, basically what happened was NYPL came to us and said, we have all of our library patrons are coming to our librarians and asking them about AI, and, we don't really have a great answer. And so could you help us explain it. And
Librarians to the rescue.
So I know librarians are just, they're the heroes, the heroes. And so we, together with our partners at NYPL, we put together this 4-event series open to the public. You can come and, you sign up online, and you can come in person, and you can also watch it online. That is intended to kind of experiment with this idea of like, how do we bring some sense making around a set of kind of bounded issues related to AI. So we're doing 4 series. We did one 2 weeks ago, which
was the highest. What is the?
We
what did they
were
tell
told what I heard from my team that we got from the NYPL folks was that it was the biggest public reaction to a public event that they had. And we were sold out. And it was called Understanding AI: What People Need to Know. And it was a great conversation with some of our friends from the Data and Society universe. And we have another conversation tonight about AI's impact on the environment, and critically, not just here it is, but also what can we do about that right now? Again, a great set of panelists. We have another one coming up on AI and the public interest that Charlton and I will be part of. And then we have a final event in November that's about AI and work and human value, which is a framing I love, because I think in some ways that sort of wraps it up and really gets to the heart of, what I think everybody is really grappling with, which is like, what is human value in this environment?
Yeah. Cool. Okay. Well, I think we should leave it there, but I also feel like that is not the end of that, because it seems like November may be the last one, but it sounds like maybe there's enough heat.
I think there's a lot more to do. I think we are at a moment where we need a much broader conversation and a much broader effort at that kind of sense making, and then moving into action about how AI is coming into our lives, into society, into our politics. And so I hope that Data and Society can be a part of that, with, obviously with a lot of other people who are working on this.
Nice. Okay. So beyond the nerd club, I'm into it.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay. Well, I feel like let's stop it there, but thank you. This was wonderful. This is exactly the conversation I wanted to have. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.